On the morning of March 21st, 1947, a New York cop tried to push open a basement door in Harlem, but it wouldn't budge. At first, he figured it was just an old house with a sticky door. But when he gave it a harder push, he realized something on the other side was blocking it. Now, it was obvious to him that it wasn't a lock or a person. It felt like a solid wall of stuff was blocking the way in. Law enforcement worked for hours to break through the junk that was stacked from floor to ceiling so tightly that it looked like a literal wall. It took another 3 weeks to figure out the bizarre truth of what had actually happened to the two men they found dead inside. This is the story of Homer and Langley Collyer.
At 8:53 that morning, a man calling himself Charles Smith had phoned the police and told them he believed there was a dead body inside a house on 5th Avenue in Harlem. The police weren't strangers to that address, and by 10 a.m., 2 officers were standing outside of it, and a crowd was already gathering behind them. The Collyer Brothers weren't strangers to their neighbors either. They were local legends, the kind people whispered about for years without actually ever meeting. Now word spread fast, and within the hour, several hundred people had packed the sidewalk to watch, eager to see what was waiting inside. The officers knocked, but there was no answer. The door was locked, and there was no alarm bell, and no way to see inside the house. They forced their way through an iron grille covering the basement door, and that's when they hit it. A wall, and not a metaphorical one, an actual wall, packed floor to ceiling with crates, furniture, and bundled newspaper, sealing the entrance shut. So they called for backup. Police Emergency Squad 6, the kind of unit you bring in when a routine call stops being routine. And when they arrived, they went after the front door with axes. Same result, another wall of debris on the other side, just as solid as the first. It was a few hours later, around 12:10 in the afternoon, that a patrolman named William Barker finally found a way in, climbing a ladder up to the second-story window. He disappeared inside for several minutes, and when he reappeared, he called down 4 words to the officers waiting below. "There's a DOA here." It would take investigators nearly 3 weeks and the removal of well over 100 tons of material from that house to understand exactly what "here" meant, and that the man Barker found wasn't the only body in the house. He just happened to be the one they found first. The house belonged to 2 very wealthy Ivy League educated brothers, Langley and Homer. Now, neither of them had been seen in public for years, and the few people who had glimpsed them treated it like a sighting of Bigfoot, something you told your neighbors about over the fence.
The Collyer brothers were not always strange men hiding behind a wall of garbage. For most of their early lives, they were exactly the kind of sons a Gilded Age family in New York would have been proud of. Homer Lusk Collyer was born in 1881. Langley Wakeman Collyer came along about 4 years later in 1885. Their father, Dr. Herman Collyer, was a respected gynecologist who worked out of Bellevue Hospital. Their mother, Susie, had trained as an opera singer. The family had deep New York roots. They could trace their church membership at Trinity Church back to 1697, and in 1909, Herman moved the family into a 4-story brownstone at 2078 Fifth Avenue on the corner of 128th Street in Harlem. Now, at the time, that stretch of Fifth Avenue was an upscale address. The Collyers had arrived. Both boys went to Columbia University. Homer studied law and went on to practice as a maritime attorney. Langley studied engineering and chemistry, but his real passion was music, and he became a skilled concert pianist, good enough to perform at Carnegie Hall. For a while, both brothers stayed involved in their community. They taught Sunday school at Trinity Church, they held jobs, Langley sold pianos. By every visible measure, the Collyer sons were successful, educated, socially engaged men. Dad Herman and Mom Susie had actually separated years earlier. Herman moved out to the Upper West Side while Susie stayed in the Harlem brownstone with their sons. Now, when Herman died in 1923, he left his sons his belongings, including equipment and furniture from his medical practice. All of it went into the house on Fifth Avenue. When Susie died 6 years later in 1929, the brothers inherited the rest of her estate too, and the brownstone itself became fully theirs. Now, this is usually the point where people assume the hoarding just began, but it didn't. For about 4 more years after their mother's death, Homer and Langley kept up a relatively normal life. They went out, they worked, but underneath that normal surface, something had already started to shift. The neighborhood around them was changing fast during the Great Migration, as Harlem became one of the most significant Black cultural centers in the country. And many of the old white families who'd settled there a generation earlier started moving out. The Colliers stayed. And as the demographics around them shifted, so did their relationship to their colored neighbors. Then in 1933, the real turning point hit. Homer went blind. The cause was hemorrhaging behind his eyes, and it happened gradually, but it was permanent. Langley quit his job on the spot to take care of his brother full-time.
Langley didn't put Homer in a hospital. He didn't hire a nurse. He took over everything himself, bathing him, dressing him, feeding him, and he became convinced that he could cure him. Langley built his brother a diet specifically designed in his mind to restore his eyesight. Black bread, peanut butter, and every single week, roughly 100 oranges. He told at least one reporter years later that he was also holding on to every newspaper that came through the house so that when Homer regains his sight, he can catch up on the news. Langley wasn't hoarding randomly. In his mind, almost everything he brought into that house had a purpose tied to taking care of his brother. The brothers stopped paying their bills. The city repossessed a separate lot they owned across the street to cover $1,900 in back taxes. Langley actually fought it, arguing that since the two of them had no income, they shouldn't owe income tax at all. It's a strange detail, but it captures who Langley had become. A man capable of constructing a precise, logical argument while living in conditions that had stopped making logical sense long ago. Eventually, the gas and water got shut off too. Langley adapted to that the way he adapted to everything, by building his own systems. He rigged a small kerosene heater, he used a Model T Ford engine to generate electricity, he hauled water to the house from a park several blocks away, only going out at night. He would walk for miles after midnight, sometimes as far as 6 miles round trip, just to get bread and newspapers, picking up interesting items along the way home. Every single thing he found, he kept. Neighborhood kids had taken to throwing rocks at the window. The house had reportedly been broken into more than once as well, convincing Langley that the world outside was hostile. His fears slowly amplified, and he built tripwires through the house, set to collapse stacks of heavy debris onto anyone who set them off in the dark. Those were deliberate defenses against intruders that Langley was certain would eventually come for what little they had left. By the late 1930s, the house at 2078 Fifth Avenue had become local legend. In 1938, the New York Times ran a story about the brothers refusing an offer of $125,000 to sell the property, and once that story ran, the rumors multiplied. People said the Colliers were secretly sitting on a fortune in cash they were too paranoid to put in a bank. People said the inside of the house looked like some kind of oriental palace. None of that was true. What was true, and far stranger than the rumors, was simpler. 2 men, alone in a house, slowly closing in around them, with newspapers stacked to the ceiling and tunnels instead of hallways. By the early 1940s, Langley had been seen so rarely that some neighbors weren't sure he still lived there at all. And then, in March of 1947, the calls to police stopped being about rocks through windows or rumors of buried treasure. This time, somebody called about the smell of a decomposing body.
After hours of trying to get into the home, crawling their way through mountains of stuff, they found Homer first in the bedroom upstairs. He was sitting upright in a chair, wrapped in a tattered blue and white bathrobe, his head tipped forward into his lap. Near Homer's body, police found 34 separate bank passbooks, representing 34 different accounts holding a combined total of roughly $3,000. The medical examiner would later determine that Homer had died of starvation, with heart disease as a contributing factor, and strangely, that he'd only been dead for around 10 hours. Now, this didn't make sense to investigators. They had come to the house because of a tip about a decomposing body, but Homer hadn't been dead anywhere near long enough to produce that kind of smell, which meant one of two things. Either the tip was wrong, or there was someone else in the house. They just hadn't found him yet. Police searched for Langley. They couldn't find him anywhere in the house, and for a while, the assumption shifted. Maybe he'd been the one to call in the tip himself, panicked after his brother died, and fled. Reports of Langley sightings started rolling in from across the tri-state area in the days that followed. New Jersey, upstate New York, all unconfirmed. Homer was blind, and he had been blind for 14 years. He couldn't just navigate that house on his own, a house so dense with debris that police officers needed hours and crowbars to move through it. Someone had been feeding him. Someone had been caring for him every single day inside of that maze. So if Langley wasn't a fugitive, then where was he? The search for him would stretch on for more than 2 weeks, while cleanup crews kept pulling truckload after truckload out of the house. And the city, and soon the country, watched a strange story get stranger day by day.
With the search for Langley still going strong, the clean out of 2078 Fifth Avenue became its own spectacle. What came out of that house reads less like an inventory and more like a museum's worst nightmare. 14 pianos, 5 violins, a dismantled Model T Ford chassis, an X-ray machine, the jawbone of a horse, human organs, and a 2-headed baby preserved in jars, left over from their father's medical practice decades earlier. Dressmakers' dummies, chandeliers, bowling balls, guns, cameras, baby carriages, tens of thousands of books, and newspapers bundled, stacked, and saved by the literal ton, dating back years and kept on the off chance that Homer would someday be able to read them. 8 cats were found living in the wreckage. So were rats, a lot of them. In total, workers hauled out somewhere around 120 to 140 tons of material. It took weeks. And on April 8, 1947, more than 2.5 weeks after Homer's body was discovered, a workman found Langley. He was just 10 feet from where his brother had died, inside a narrow tunnel he'd built himself out of compacted newspaper bundles, old bed springs, and a chest of drawers. He was covered by a suitcase, more newspaper bundles, and 3 metal bread boxes. His body had already been partially scavenged by rats, and his remains, it turned out, were the actual source of the decomposition smell that had reached the original tipster. Investigators estimated, based on decomposition, that Langley had been dead since around March 9th, meaning he had died before his brother, which sadly meant Homer, blind, immobile, and entirely dependent on his brother for food and care, had spent the final days of his own life alone in that house with no one coming. He likely had no idea Langley was already dead just a few feet away. He simply waited for a brother who was never coming back until his body gave out from starvation. Police pieced together what had most likely happened to Langley using the layouts of the tunnel and the booby trap rigged above it. He had appeared to have been crawling through that tunnel, the same route he used constantly to bring Homer his food and supplies, when he triggered one of his own traps. A cascade of debris meant to stop intruders came down on him instead. Investigators determined he died of asphyxiation, crushed and buried by the very system he'd constructed to protect them both. The man who spent 14 years building walls against the outside world had ultimately been killed by his own fortification, and in doing so had unintentionally sentenced his blind, helpless brother to a slow, agonizing death.
The city tore the house down just months after the bodies were found, citing it as a fire and safety hazard. Homer and Langley were buried together in unmarked graves next to their parents at Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn. No headstones, no names. Two brothers who had spent decades refusing to let the world in disappeared into the ground just as quietly. What was salvageable from the house, including, oddly enough, the chair Homer had died in, was auctioned off and put on public display at a dime museum, where it sat alongside sideshow attractions for paying crowds to gawk at. 56 people came forward claiming to be heirs to the estate. A New York court eventually settled it among 23 verified cousins, none of them close, because neither brother had ever married or had children of their own. The men who had sealed themselves away from the world left everything they had to people who barely knew them. And yet, somehow, they never really disappeared at all. Firefighters across the country still use the word Collyer to flag a building so packed with debris it can kill a rescue worker. Mental health professionals coined Collyer Brothers syndrome to describe severe hoarding paired with social isolation, a term still in use today. A 1955 episode of The Honeymooners referenced them. E.L. Doctorow wrote a novel about them in 2009. There is a boutique in Brooklyn Heights that uses their name, and in 1965 the empty lot where their home had stood was turned into a small public park, the Collyer Brothers Park, still there today at the corner of 128th and 5th. A patch of green where a fortress used to be. Named after two men the neighborhood couldn't stop talking about even after there was nothing left to see. For more true crime and dark and mysterious stories, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to get notified when we release a new episode. We'll see you again next week.